This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Reagan Institute Policy Director Rachel Hoff sits down with Sebastien Lai and Jonathan Price. Sebastien Lai is the son of Jimmy Lai, a renowned Hong Kong media entrepreneur, writer, and pro-democracy campaigner who founded Next Digital and Apple Daily, the popular independent Chinese-language newspaper in Hong Kong, which was forcibly shut down in 2021. Jimmy Lai has been imprisoned in Hong Kong since December 2020 and now awaits trial this month. Sebastien is leading the international #FreeJimmyLai campaign to secure his father's release. Jonathan Price is a lawyer serving as international counsel for Jimmy and Sebastien Lai.
Well, hello and welcome to Reaganism. I'm your guest host, Rachel Hoff, and I'm so pleased to introduce you all today to two people who are truly on the front lines of the struggle for freedom in today's world, Sebastien Lai and Jonathan Price. Sebastien is the son of Jimmy Lai, who's a successful businessman and media entrepreneur in Hong Kong. He emerged as a leader of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong and as a result has been imprisoned as part of the Chinese Communist Party's crackdown under its national security law. Sebastian's been leading the campaign for his father's freedom, and Jonathan is a human rights lawyer who's part of Jimmy Lai's international legal team. Jonathan, Sebastien, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having us.
Sebastien, I'd like to start with you. We'll get to the details of your father's case and his imprisonment later in the show. But to start, would you set the stage a bit for our listeners, many of whom have probably never been to Hong Kong? What was life like in Hong Kong prior to the Chinese Communist Party's latest crackdown, and what has it been like in more recent years?
Hong Kong was, Hong Kong used to be wonderful. It was one of the examples of a free, it was a special administrative region. Before that, it was a British colony, but it was one of the free cities in Asia that was really held up as this example of Chinese people having these freedoms and then building this metropolis. A lot of the people, like my father, were refugees from China. I have these very lovely memories of when I was younger. During June 4th, we'd go to Victoria Park to commemorate the Tiananmen Square massacre, and we'd all hold out a candle for all of the students that were all over by tanks, shot, killed in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square. And they'd have the song that I still sometimes plays in my mind, and it was called Ziyaofa, which means freedom flower. And the line goes, it sort of goes, no matter how much it rains, the flower of freedom will bloom one day. Which is why I tell that story is because last year they didn't allow the Tiananmen Square memorial to happen in Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be the only city in China where that was allowed. So I hope that gives a good perspective of the change.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Jonathan, the legal mechanism that the CCP has used to execute the crackdown on freedom and democracy in Hong Kong is this national security law. Explain a bit, if you would, about sort of the legal context under which this is happening.
Yes, Rachel. So the national security law is a new set of legislative provisions introduced in June 2020 to Hong Kong. But to understand it, one has to go back to the moment when Hong Kong ceased to be British in 1997 and was handed back at the expiry of its lease to China. And at that handover, a settlement had been negotiated between the British and the Chinese, by which the Chinese promised to uphold certain basic freedoms that Hong Kong had enjoyed whilst under British rule for 50 years. It was the so-called one country, two systems doctrine. And by that doctrine, whilst Hong Kong would be Chinese, it would have its own legal system and a very high degree of autonomy in relation to that legal system and the government of its own internal domestic affairs. The one country, two systems doctrine introduced something called the Basic Law to Hong Kong. And as I've said, within the Basic Law were guaranteed basic freedoms like the freedom of expression, the freedom of peaceful assembly, and some very limited democratic reforms, not pure democracy by any stretch, but something which it was hoped would head in that direction during that 50-year period. And these freedoms existed until relatively recently. So bearing in mind that the handover was 1997, they were supposed to last until 2047. And unfortunately what happened was that in 2014, some further legislative changes were suggested in Hong Kong, which would erode some of the freedoms that had been protected by the Basic Law. In particular, a law was proposed by which Hong Kongers could be extradited to the Chinese mainland if they were caught up in criminal proceedings. And there were huge protests, and viewers and listeners may well remember that Hong Kong went through one of two recent periods of civil protest where millions of people took to the streets to protest against the encroachment of Beijing ahead of the 50-year deadline. Fast forward only a few years to 2019, and more protests erupted, and it became clear then that China wasn't going to put up with the way that the Hong Kong authorities were managing their own affairs. And within a year of that, the NSL, the National Security Law, was implemented, as I said, on the 30th of June, 2020. And it was implemented in order to crack down on the peaceful protests that have been going on, because these were becoming embarrassing and threatening to the Chinese. And if there's any doubt about that, the day after the implementation of the NSL on the 30th of June, so on the 1st of July 2020, the first arrests were made under the NSL within 24 hours of it coming into effect. 10 people were arrested, and all of those that were arrested because of their participation in the peaceful protests a year earlier. So you've got the lawyers amongst us know that to retroactively apply a law already offends basic principles of the rule of law. Laws should be forward-looking, not backward-looking. But here we had a law being applied to conduct that had already taken place. So there was an immediate egregious failure on that front. The NSL itself is a law which criminalizes a huge range of otherwise perfectly lawful activity. So anything from protesting in favor of democracy to questioning the legitimacy of the Hong Kong government becomes a criminal offence under the NSL, and it's drafted so broadly it's impossible to tell whether your conduct might be criminalised or not. It's the classic dictator's sort of authoritarian playbook of imposing ostensibly security laws that are so broad they can be applied to anybody, including your political opponents, and that's what we've seen happen in Hong Kong.
Well, and it's so powerful to hear that same tragic story from each of you, from what life was like before to what life is like now, and then Jonathan from the perspective of those changes in law over time that have led to what we're seeing today. Let's talk a bit about Jimmy Lai. Sebastien, introduce us to your father. How did he grow up? How did he make his name and his success in business?
So my father's been in jail for almost 3 years now. At 75, he's awaiting his national security law trial that they keep delaying. But actually, it's very morbid. But my father's story is actually a very beautiful story. My father was born in China, sort of around the 1940s, 48, 49. He doesn't know, because the thing is, back in those days, you weren't you weren't marked as a person when you were born. It was chaos.
That was a very important time in Chinese history.
It was a very, very, yes, that's a very, very important, very bad time in Chinese history. He decided to escape to Hong Kong when he was 13. And Hong Kong, 12 or 13, but Hong Kong was essentially a British colony. And when he arrived, that was the first time he was marked as a person, that he was recognized by a government as a person. And the first day he started working at a glove factory because he had to pay for the crossing fee, essentially. The thing is that what I find wonderful is obviously these times were, from what I hear, incredibly tough. But Dad has very fond memories of it. He tells me that the next morning, after he landed, the person running the factory gave him a bit of money, knowing that he was very young and didn't have anybody in the world in Hong Kong. He went to breakfast and he started crying because he was like, this was the first time he saw so much food. So even though he has a lot of these reminders of that time he has in this factory, one of his ears he can't really hear out of, the finger got caught in a machine, so parts of it is gone. He's still he's how he describes it is like he was in heaven. He then went on to manage a factory at a very young age, which gave him the opportunity to go to America, where he learned of the works of Friedrich Hayek, and he's a profuse reader, so he read all of Friedrich Hayek's books. He came back to Hong Kong, started this company called Giordano. Sorry, I skipped a part. He opened his own manufacturing plant and then decided to go into this company called Giordano. And Giordano was, if you think about it, sort of as a precursor to Uniqlo. So not a lot of different types of clothing, but very good quality at a very, very cheap price. And that took off. That was a hugely successful brand, growing at 30% a year, even after they had IPO'd. That leads us to Tiananmen Square, to 89, when the democratic protests were breaking out across China, because it wasn't just in Tiananmen Square, it was across China. My father was incredibly hopeful, right? Because he thought with these freedoms that he had, and that he, were these freedoms that allowed him to grow into who he was, to do what he wanted to do in business. If those freedoms went to China, then a lot of other people would bloom. Turns out that wasn't the case. Turns out the Tiananmen Square massacre happened. And for him, it was a huge hit. It was I think he saw himself in I guess a lot of people, right? These were students who just loved freedom, got rolled over by tanks. So he decided to start Next Magazine, and then Apple Daily. And the premise of it was that these were magazines that were going to be widely read, instead of the traditional academic Chinese of the literature of those days. He was going to use a colloquial Chinese, so anybody could pick it up and understand it. And they were going to be pro-democracy. They were going to be honest, and print the truth and not be afraid of the powerful. It was very popular. And they Apple Daily started in 95, and then ran for 25, 26 years, and then the national security law got passed, everybody was telling Dad that he should leave because they were one of the people that they'll go for first. As you could expect, a pro-democracy newspaper is not very well liked by the elites and the government in Hong Kong. Tremendous respect for my father. He decided to say, you don't choose where you're born, but you choose where you call it home, and you defend it when someone some comes for it.
There's, we talk in this country all the time about the American dream, and your father's story sounds like such a perfect example of that. Is there a concept of a Hong Kong dream, starting as the factory worker and then having your own manufacturing facility and successful business?
I think that really is. I mean, it's it's the free market, right?
Right.
I mean, a lot of people see these. Hong Kong government will tell you that these freedoms are Western values. They're not. They're values of the free world. Reagan. President Reagan, mm-hmm. There were values of the free world. It wasn't every person deserves it. It doesn't matter where you were born. So there definitely was that element of Hong Kong dream. I think what makes my father's story so exceptional is that a lot of people give currency to the term money isn't everything, and there aren't a lot of occasions around the world where someone proves that is the case. Someone is willing to give up everything he has to stand up for his belief in the fundamental freedoms of another person. And it's incredible because I saw this video of him, this interview of him from the BBC, dating back, I think, before Hanover, so 25 years. And when he asks, whether he'd leave after a Hanover, he tears up and says, "This is my home. Mm-hmm. Unless my life was in danger, I'm not leaving." So it's been a career, and it's been a daily thing for the past 25, 30 years.
I think what you describe is one of the most amazing parts of your father's story, which is that, there are so few people who find so much success in business who would then stick their neck out there for some sort of cause, right? And it certainly predated the national security law and the pro-democracy protests, even back to his even starting a pro-democracy newspaper in the wake of Tiananmen. You said, he saw himself in the Tiananmen protesters. Well, what do you think it is inside of somebody like that who's willing to, give up all of that that he's rightfully earned and worked so hard for something like the cause of freedom?
I think that I think that that's actually a question I think about a lot. I think the case with my father is because he's sometimes asked before he's in prison by other people. He's like, there's a lot of tycoons. Are you angry at them that you're the only one standing up? And he's like, he's not. Like a lot of these, they obviously you have bad people, but a lot of these guys are pretty good guys. Like you'd be friends with them. It's just that China has a way of corrupting people, right? They give you a bit, and then they demand nothing, and they give you a bit more, and then they demand something, and then bit by bit, they have you in their pockets. It's that idea of corrupting, and then one day you wake up and you don't have the same views as you did, when you were 30 or when you're 40. I think what makes Dad so special is that though he reads a lot, he has a very independent sense of what is right and wrong. And he has stood by that for 30 years. He knew that individual freedoms, human rights, was the right thing. It's I guess another way to put it is that in these autocratic regimes, there's a huge cost to being an honest man, especially when you are in business, especially when there's people harassing you. Dad had his shops, burnt and whatnot. It's the cost of being an honest man, and I think he never forgot that. He never forgot, and for him it's his home. So it was a pretty. I say it's obviously it was a very hard road, but it was a pretty easy decision for him to keep walking down this very hard road.
Yeah. Jonathan, pick up Jimmy Lai's story from there. So he finds success in business. He founds what goes on to be a very prominent pro-democracy newspaper and media company. How does he become sort of a real target of the Chinese Communist Party under the NSL, or national security law?
Excuse me. Well, as Sebastien has said, what he represented when he abandoned his clothing industry businesses, which had really made him an extremely wealthy man, and looked set to just make him even wealthier over the sort of second part of his life, in order to found a mouthpiece for pro-democracy views, and not just pro-democracy views, but an independent organ which would reflect the views of Hong Kongers. Not only that, would entertain them. There's plenty of gossip in Apple Daily, plenty of political commentary, and plenty of material challenging the government to do better with the lives of Hong Kongers. And that's a very dangerous thing. You've got a guy who's shown that he is not he's not beholden to his business interests. He's unshackled himself from those. And of course, I mean, the newspaper did very well, and he found, he developed various other media projects, and was hugely successful in the digital space as well. That really is just because he is such a naturally good businessman, and so this represented something of an enormous threat to the instinctively autocratic Chinese, who get very jumpy at the idea that people can print what they like, and that they can spread ideas that might be contrary to the single very narrow view they have of the world and how it should be governed. And it became a matter of some importance to the Chinese and Hong Kong authorities that they get a handle on that, because I think they could see that if they didn't, the people might continue to demand change, and that's the one thing they didn't want them to have. So, with the passing of the national security law, and you'll remember, the first thing to say, obviously, is that Jimmy Lai, along with 2 million other Hong Kongers, I mean, a third of the population of the city, took part in these protests seeking democratic changes and opposing the autocratic changes that were being imposed upon them in the mainland. He took part in vigils commemorating Tiananmen Square, which became controversial for the first time towards the end of the last decade. And so the NSL was passed. I mean, not solely to target Jimmy Lai, as I've said, it was to target the protests generally. But because he'd been partaking in the protests, it was obviously an opportunity for the authorities to deal with the Jimmy Lai problem and the Apple Daily problem. And as I've said, the day after the implementation of the NSL, which coincidentally was the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, the beginning of the Tiananmen Square protests, 10 people were arrested, and 10 days later, Jimmy Lai himself was also arrested. His office was raided. His office being the headquarters of Apple Daily. He was marched out in handcuffs, very public. Perp walk in order to intimidate other protesters and pro-democracy campaigners, and there began a string of legal problems that continue to this day. What we call this tactic by autocratic regimes, lawfare. Every tool in the legal box is used against an individual like this in order to deplete their resources, destroy their business, to defame and slander them. And as we may come to, he's been convicted on totally trumped up fraud charges in one case in order to make it harder for people to support him, but that has failed. And he was arrested on national security charges, and his office was raided, as I've said. He was then prosecuted for 4 separate protest offences under the old sedition laws. He was prosecuted on this ridiculous fraud charge, which is basically nothing more than a contractual dispute, which the government turned into a major fraud case, all over the subletting of a tiny portion of Apple Daily's office. And for that, he was sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison. He's still in prison today, awaiting trial in the national security law case against him, which centers around his perfectly lawful pro-democracy activity. And they are trying to paint him as someone who was trying to overthrow the Hong Kong government simply because he wished to change the government that was governing him, and change it not by revolution but by evolution through perfectly democratic means and peaceful means. He's a very peaceful man. What is extraordinary about Jimmy Lai is that he I think embodies the person that we all would like to think we would be in that position. We'd all like to be hugely successful in business, and I'm sure some of those listening are. And we all like to think that we have the right values in our hearts, and that we talk about those values, and that we espouse those values, and that we give to causes that embody those values. But how many of us would, when at a crossroads, choose almost certain imprisonment, incarceration, lengthy legal battles, and oppression by one's own government, rather than a life of comfort in another jurisdiction? He could have left Hong Kong. Jimmy Lai is a British citizen. He holds a British passport. He knew what was coming down the track, and he could have left, and he didn't. He stayed, and he knew what was coming, and he stayed to stand up and be counted, because he'd made Hong Kong his home. He'd chosen to live there. He'd chosen to live under those values, and he stayed and fought for them. And it's very inspiring. And I think when one considers it in that way, it's very easy to be inspired to stand up and be counted oneself. And that's what we want people to do. We want people to think about that, think about the values they talk about, that they profess to espouse, and actually live by them, and be prepared to give up other aspects of their lives in order to support them. These are very important values.
Thanks especially for sharing the broader context of everything else, everyone else fighting for freedom in Hong Kong there. You mentioned the millions of protesters taking to the streets in recent years. Jimmy Lai is not the only one in prison under the national security law, but his prominence, his wealth, as you note, he had the resources to leave. As Sebastien said, many prominent Hong Kongers did leave, and choosing to stay and choosing to be a prominent figure and to give not just a face, as masses of students can in Tiananmen or in the Hong Kong protests, but the face, the name, the voice of a leading Hong Kong citizen has really brought so much attention. We at the Reagan Institute, of course, think about parallels to the Reagan administration, to the Cold War. There were so many Soviet political prisoners, refuseniks, dissidents who were household names around the world, Natan Sharansky and others, who brought light to the cases of those who were fighting with them, whose names we don't know. And so certainly the decisions that he's made are incredibly admirable in that way. I want to pull on a couple threads of what Jonathan just went over. Jonathan, talk a bit more about the trial itself. What should we know about the independence or lack thereof of Hong Kong's judiciary? What's your assessment there? And what role do Beijing and sort of the central Chinese Communist Party play in the trial, or might they play?
So the NSL has created, the National Security Law has created a number of institutions by which it is implemented. And as I said previously, the one country, two systems doctrine had purported to establish autonomy in Hong Kong by the use of a sort of pseudo-democratic device called the legislative council, which was supposed to be a local body in Hong Kong that was supposed to be responsible for legislation that affected Hong Kong. The NSL, however, was imposed directly by Beijing on Hong Kong. It wasn't voted for by the Hong Kong people, and it set up these institutions, these national security bodies, the National Security Department in particular, which implements it. And the National Security Department is not accountable democratically to the Hong Kong people. It is accountable to the Chinese government, the CCP. And another device under the NSL is that NSL cases brought under the NSL must be tried by judges appointed or at least licensed by the National Security Department. And what that means is that prosecutions brought under the NSL have an inbuilt, baked-in bias towards carrying out the will of the CCP. They have recently boasted that in relation to NSL trials, they have a 100% success rate and 100% conviction rate. That the prosecutor's office obviously believes this is something to be proud of. But I think anybody who has spent any time in the criminal justice system knows that if you have a 100% conviction rate in any jurisdiction, something's probably going wrong, because it's just not right that everybody picked up and prosecuted is guilty. And a properly functioning criminal justice system must be capable of delivering acquittals, just in the same way that it must be capable of delivering convictions. So it's nothing to be proud of having a 100% conviction rate. It just proves what we've always said, which is that these handpicked judges implementing laws imposed by Beijing are simply doing the bidding of their political masters by convicting everybody that comes into their courts. So we don't have any confidence in the system, and as Sebastien said, this appears to be a show trial, and is as much about seeking to keep the screws on the Hong Kong population by persecuting one of a peaceful but nevertheless important voice from amongst its own ranks.
An example worth mentioning about how the national security law bleeds into the common law is that one of my father's charges that he's finished serving now, though he wasn't let out on bail, was that he got 13 months, and this goes back to what we were saying in the beginning. He got 13 months for lighting a candle and saying a prayer at a Tiananmen Square vigil.
Wow.
It really shows the contrast.
Yeah. These mechanisms and trumped up charges and detentions have a very real human cost too. Sebastien, tell us a bit about, what that's been like. Have you been able to see your father, to be in contact with him?
So I found out my father was imprisoned. When he was taken to the police station the first time, I was actually in quarantine in Taiwan. So I had been there for 7 days, and someone knocked on my door at 6 a.m. to tell me that Dad was taken, and he was released. And then that was in August, and then in December of that year, 2020, he was taken in again, and essentially held until now. And so, because of how broad the national security law is, as Jonathan mentioned, I haven't been back. As a result of, for example, just us speaking out right now, telling you the story could very well be a charge under the national security law. So unfortunately, I haven't seen him in 3 years.
What has that decision been like for you, to speak out, to be an advocate, not just for your father, but for his for freedom in Hong Kong. Did you want to be an activist, or was this a path that you felt like you had no other choice?
I mean, I guess look, I find activists around the world incredibly brave. I myself am not. I mean, I don't see myself necessarily as an activist. It's my dad. It's my dad. He's unfairly imprisoned, and so it's not a tough choice for me to speak out. I actually started speaking out when he got the conviction charge for the lease violation, because that showed that the Hong Kong legal system was completely destroyed, and there was no chance that he was ever going to get a semblance of a free trial in Hong Kong. And I stand by this statement, and my father should not be in jail. It's as simple as that. It's not under the Hong Kong laws. My father should not be in jail, and so I am. I'll keep speaking out no matter the cost until he's out.
Jonathan mentioned that your father is a British citizen. He holds a UK passport. He's also Catholic. And there have been many who have said, and I believe you have as well, that the UK government, that the Vatican perhaps should be doing more to call for his freedom, his release. Why do you think that hasn't happened?
I think the world is waking up to. I think the world is waking up to what China is on an international level of what's happening to Hong Kong. I think the UK look, over the last few months, the UK has spoken out a bit more. Obviously, they're still not using the language. No, they're not. They haven't. I don't think they've called for his release yet or condemned what's happening to him. But they've gone from not speaking about him at all to at least having the dialogue, which I am grateful for. But I definitely think that a case so emblematic of a man's defense of freedom should be defended more by a nation who professes those freedoms, a nation like the UK. And it's also worth noting that when you give a passport to someone, you want them to be a good person. You want them to stand for these values. That is a citizen. You want to turn to the world and say, "This is our guy." So I think it's very misguided. The UK's position is that they have to be pragmatic and whatnot. And I think it's a very short-term way of viewing things, because the pragmatic thing for that to do would have just to cow to Beijing, to make as much money as possible, and then go to the UK, and then that's it. Those are not. I think you could ask any UK politician that those are not the people that you want. You want someone who stands up for their home, stays with his people, and through thick and thin. And I think the UK government is waking up to that, and I think it is obviously in their benefit to scream to the world that this is our guy. This is someone that we're proud of to be a UK citizen. Regarding the Vatican, I obviously I'm a Catholic. My father's Catholic. He's a very devout Catholic, and I think religion is really what keeps him so strong. Is the belief of right and wrong, of a God above that loves us all. So I think the Holy Sees will also, hopefully they'll also wake up to this and speak on my father's behalf, on Cardinal Zhen's behalf. But in the end of the day, God's above, and he's watching. So I think the Holy Sees will have to wake up to it.
Yeah. Jonathan, you're an international human rights lawyer. Public awareness is such an important part of the case of dissidents and calling for the freedom of political prisoners. But from a policy perspective, what more could foreign governments, whether it's the UK or the US, be doing for political prisoners, whether it's Jimmy Lai, others in Hong Kong, or around the world?
Well, the main focus, I think, in policy is accountability, and that means visibility, and it means speaking his name in relations with China and Hong Kong. It means not normalizing the activities that are happening in Hong Kong, instigated by the Chinese government. It means calling out the just dreadful repression of not just Jimmy Lai, but all those that have sought peaceful change in Hong Kong. And, we're beginning to see that, but it's happened very quickly. Rachel, 3 or 4 years ago, this was almost unimaginable. Hong Kong was still a thriving, bustling, money-making metropolis full of people with, by regional standards, a relatively high degree of freedom and great optimism about the future, able to buy a copy of Sebastian's dad's newspaper on every street corner. And here we are 4 years later, at the beginning of this year, they sold off the very printing presses that had enabled that in the fire sale because they dissolved his company under spurious national security, for spurious national security reasons. So the world is, as Sebastian said, is waking up to this. But governments are a little bit slow to react, but we are seeing that it's happening. So, as I said, we mustn't let them get away with it. We must make sure there's a huge political cost to this activity. And for sort of global political reasons, it's important that we try to support Hong Kong as it was, because it was vital. It was a beacon of free trade, free expression, and free enterprise in the region. And without that, the region itself will go dark. Mm-hmm.
We always end our podcasts on an optimistic note. We're named after President Reagan, so we know no other way. But before we get to our lightning round, let me ask you, Sebastien, what are your hopes and aspirations for Hong Kong's future?
I think the government of Hong Kong and the government of China will at some point realize that they've got to be man and woman of their words. They can't tell the world that they still have all these freedoms, freedom of press, freedom of speech, rule of law, and basically put these freedoms on a show drum. Persecute my father, 1,500 political prisoners are in Hong Kong jail at the moment. They can't. So in 2021, after my father was arrested, they raided Apple Daily's offices. Apple Daily was the biggest newspaper in Hong Kong, and they sent 500 policemen into the offices, ripped computers away, stop all the journalists from working, and eventually closed it down. That is not a place that has freedom of press or freedom of speech. It's in their best interest and in the interest of the world, to be honest, that Hong Kong goes back to this place where these different ideals can coexist and be tested. So that is what I hope for Hong Kong's future. I know time doesn't go back, but it's that would be what the thing to do would be, and obviously to release my father.
Right. Well, we end each episode by asking our guests for a favorite book about President Reagan, favorite quote from President Reagan, or favorite speech. Do you all have anything to share? You can do 3, 2, or just one.
So obviously he was a very folksy, funny man. One of the quotes that I really liked was when he was asked whether he'd be a good governor or not. Mm-hmm. And he replied, "I don't know. I've never played a governor before." But I've got another one, and I it's quite long. So do you mind if I pull that?
Please.
I would not like to butcher his eloquent words. It's And tonight we declare anew to our fellow citizens of the world, freedom is not the sole prerogative of a chosen few. It is a universal right of all God's children. Look to where peace and prosperity flourishes today. It is in homes that freedom built. Victory against poverty are greatest, and peace most secure where people live by laws and ensure free press, free speech, and freedom to worship, vote, and create wealth. And, after all these years, it holds true.
It holds true indeed. I believe that quote might be from President Reagan's speech to the British Parliament at Westminster. So, Jonathan, speaking to your heritage there as well.
Well, I should say that I'm, unlike Sebastien, old enough just to remember President Reagan's 2 terms in office. But I was very young, and I'll be honest, my interest then was less in policy, and I wasn't even a human rights lawyer. So the inception of the Reagan doctrine, I have to say, rather passed me by. But I do remember him dancing with my prime minister. And I remember being absolutely fascinated that a cowboy could become president.
Well, a wonderful note to end on, not only aspirational words, but the human element from his humor to those lighter moments as president as well. Jonathan Pryce, Sebastien Lai, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to you all for listening.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.